Hey everyone, it's Michael here and welcome to Maps and More. Today I'm reviving an idea that I had when I started this channel, just over 2 years ago now actually, which is kind of scary to think about. I like to think I've learned a lot about YouTube since then, and about like editing and recording and all of that. So I do hope you enjoy what I got to bring you. In this series, I'm going to be kind of going through all the countries that I've been to and travelled into, and just hopefully teach you a bit about kind of the geography of these places and some information, but also kind of share my own personal travel experiences of what it's like to be there and live there and visit. So hopefully it'll be a kind of interesting and personalized way of learning about geography. If anyone has any questions about the topics I cover or any topics they want me to cover, countries they want me to do, or just, whatever, I'd be more than happy to do like follow-up videos and Q&As and things. So do, comment, get in touch. And like and subscribe to the channel if you want to kind of watch more of these. That would mean a lot to me and really encourage me to keep making them. So today's episode, first of this series, kind of in its new form, is going to be about Bosnia and Herzegovina. This is a country where I lived for 2 years between 2018 and 2020, which a lot of people probably don't know much about, but for me it's one of the most fascinating, complicated, interesting and beautiful places I've ever been. So I moved to the capital, Sarajevo, in April 2018, primarily to work with refugees and migrants and kind of a few other things as well while I was there. Never been there before, never even been to the region, but I did loads of research. I was kind of really obsessed for pretty much a year, and it was an amazing, though definitely difficult at times as well, experience. So I moved back to Scotland, where I live now, where I was born, in March 2020, right at the beginning of the pandemic. That actually ended up being, honestly, one of the most stressful weeks of my life when I was trying to get back home. We might get into that story later. But yeah, so we will later kind of talk about some of my personal experiences and like how it was for me being there and stories. First, I think I'm going to go through some of the facts and information and just kind of teach you a bit about the geography and culture of Bosnia as a country. So officially called Bosnia and Herzegovina, it's a relatively small country in Southeast Europe in the region we call the Western Balkans, as part of the wider Balkan Peninsula. So the country borders Serbia to the east, Croatia to the north and west, and Montenegro to the south. Now, all the countries that Bosnia borders, ones I've mentioned, were all formerly part of Yugoslavia, along with Bosnia between 1918 and 1991. As a land area of 51,129 square kilometres and a population of about 3.4 million, although the last official census was in 2013, so a lot of more recent figures are really just estimates. For reasons we will go into later, demographics of the country have kind of changed, fluctuated a lot over the last 30 years, and the population has been decreasing for several years now. So the capital and largest city is Sarajevo, which was my home for 2 years, with a population of around 300,000, followed by Banja Luka, Tuzla and Zenica. The second most important city culturally, however, is the city of Mostar in the historical region of Herzegovina, which is in the southwest of the country. And it's a city that I visited several times when I was living there in Sarajevo. I remember my first day in Sarajevo when one of my colleagues was teaching me how to use the tram public transport system, and she basically just dropped me off in the city centre and went, have fun, and kind of just allowed me to wander around and get lost in the city. It was just such a really freeing experience, but also kind of scary. Obviously, my first house in Sarajevo, or flat, was kind of really out in the suburbs of the city, near where the airport is. So whenever I was going into the town centre, I had to get this tram. It would take about half an hour maybe. It's an incredibly unique place, Sarajevo. It has architecture from mainly 3 different kind of broad historical periods and 3 different cultures that have kind of left their imprint on Bosnia. The historical Old Town, kind of the oldest part of Sarajevo as a city, dates from the 15th century when Bosnia became part of the Ottoman Empire, kind of Turkish-led empire. And it still has these old sort of Turkish, Middle Eastern style mosques and bazaars and minarets kind of dotted around the town and the skyline. There's a lot of little tourist stalls and everything in that old part of the city with scarves and purses and postcards, but it's still very beautiful and historic. Outside of that, you've got the Austro-Hungarian part of the city, which dates from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when Bosnia was annexed by Austria following the Treaty of Berlin in 1878. And a lot of the city's kind of infrastructure, things like the tram public transport system, a lot of schools and roads and all of that were built and improved during this Austrian period. Austria-Hungary's annexation of Bosnia wasn't the most popular thing at the time, as it's in Sarajevo, next to the Latin Bridge, Latinska Čuprija, where the Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated, which of course sparked the beginning of World War One. In that part of the city, there are Catholic and Orthodox churches, beautiful kind of Art Deco and Baroque neoclassical style facades, as well as more modern additions like various shopping centres and too many advertising boards, to be honest. But finally, beyond that is the more modern part of the city, which was really built up during the period of Yugoslavia, which is overall between 1918 and 1991, like I mentioned, but really much of that development and building happened during the urban boom in 1960s and 70s under communist rule. While some of the apartment blocks, honestly, not the prettiest things to look at, they do give the city kind of a very impressive and eclectic skyline against the contrast of the older parts of the city. There are a few lookouts. There's something called the Yellow Fortress and the White Fortress, which kind of overlook the city. You can see the skyline. It's a very interesting skyline and eclectic, but also beautiful, I think. The other thing to talk about when it comes to Sarajevo and just its outward appearance is the impact of the war. I'll do a separate video on the Yugoslav wars, on the Bosnian War at a different point, because it is very complicated. It's obviously a very heavy topic. But basically, to sum up, between 1992 and 1995, Bosnia experienced a brutal war, and Sarajevo as a city was under siege and bombardment for pretty much the entire duration of the conflict. There are several obvious and very visible reminders when you're there of the war, to be honest, everywhere you go in Sarajevo. Firstly, the bullet holes. Many buildings and houses have kind of chosen to keep the damage on the outside and the various bullet holes as a potent reminder and a symbol of what the city went through in the 90s. And it's a really strange experience the first time you go there and walk around there, especially me as a Westerner in that kind of privileged position, never having seen that sort of thing before. Secondly, there's the Sarajevske Rože, so we call the Sarajevo Roses, which are holes in the ground that were caused by mortars and grenades wherever someone was killed. And they were filled in with kind of red wax or resin, which really kind of resembles roses, which is why they're called Sarajevo Roses. Taken alongside the bullet holes, it really gives the city the feel that this conflict was pretty recent and still lives fresh in the memory of everyone there. And finally, the third thing you notice about that is graveyards and cemeteries, which are dotted around the city, especially when you go up the hills. I mentioned those lookout points earlier, the White Fortress and Yellow Fortress. You can see so many of these sort of obelisks and a few crosses, and from the thousands who died in Sarajevo during the war, scattered across the landscape of the city. So back to kind of geography and demographics, things like that. In the Balkans generally, but specifically in Bosnia, one of the most important demographic issues is that of ethnicity and religion. The country is made up of three constituent ethno-religious groups: the Muslim Bosniaks, the Orthodox Serbs, and the Catholic Croats. Now, the Bosniaks comprise about 50% of the population, the Orthodox Serbs are about 30%, and then the Croats are about 15%, with 5% being others, particularly Roma and Jews, but also foreigners and people who prefer not to identify with any of the three major ethnic groups. Although not identifying with a group does actually disadvantage you in political senses, because the country is really made up as a power-sharing balance between these three groups. If you are not considered as one of them, you're not really involved in that power-sharing political system. Actual religious observance is pretty patchy, particularly amongst younger people. Plenty of people do go to kind of mosques and churches for important events, or they observe Ramadan, particularly in Sarajevo, which is I think about 80% Muslim Bosniak. But many people, especially younger ones, are much more secular and atheist. Nonetheless, religion as a marker of your ethnic identity is still very important in Bosnia, particularly for the political kind of reasons I mentioned earlier, but also for a cultural sense of identity. Of course, because of the war in the 1990s, the war itself depends whether you consider it a civil war or whether Serbia and Croatia were involved in that, but either way, there were primarily three forces fighting against each other that were representing each of the three ethnic and national groups. As I said before, I will go into the war in more detail in another video, but it's still useful and important to remember that now as a backdrop to Bosnia's kind of culture and discussions about their ethnicity and society. So as well as 3 ethnic groups, Bosnia also has 3 official languages: Bosnian, Croatian, and Serbian, one for each of the main 3 groups. Although in reality, these are just 3 names for the same language. That's also something I'll probably go into in another video, but during my 2 years of residence in Sarajevo, I studied and learned the language the entire time, and it really helped me to be immersed and become part of the culture. And when it comes to it being 3 names for the same language, I was able to kind of understand and converse with Croats and Serbs just as easily as with Bosnians. I'll happily give a shout out to the private language school I went to. So thank you, Bosnian to go. And Leila and Azra and all of you. Which was set up by a few women kind of around my age, and they sort of run it themselves. They're fluent in English, Bosnian, and several of them in Spanish as well. And it's such as an accessible, supportive kind of atmosphere and a great interactive way of learning, practicing both conversational language as well as the grammatical and technical stuff. So anyway, the Bosnian language itself is Slavic, South Slavic specifically. So as well as each of the 3 variations being closely related to each other, it is also more broadly related to Bulgarian and Slovene, and also in a more extended way related to the likes of Polish and Russian. So the flag is a pretty unique one with a gold triangle overlaid on a blue background and a repeating line of white stars running parallel to the diagonal line of the triangle. The flag was created in the late 1990s following the war, since each side was kind of unhappy with the symbols and flags of the other sides. Blue, yellow and white are kind of the colours of peace and neutrality and Europe as well. One of the old medieval symbols of Bosnia was the lily or fleur-de-lis. But after the war, kind of those lilies became associated more with the Bosniak side, and Serbs and Croats were unhappy with that being a representation of Bosnia as a whole. Similarly, the current official national anthem actually has no words, because no lyrics could really be agreed between the different constituent ethnic groups. There are a few unofficial anthems, and particularly one of the old ones, which is Jedna si jedina. But the official one they have now was written by some international observer and doesn't contain any lyrics. Complicated attempts at power sharing, inter-ethnic compromise are just as difficult at political level as well as the cultural one, where the country has 3 rotating presidents, 2 separate states, and hundreds of smaller local governments that just make governing and bureaucracy really complicated. Corruption and executive dysfunction are something that stagnated Bosnia's development over the last 20-25 years, and while peace has been achieved, it's come at the cost of really having a functional country now in peacetime. Complicated in bureaucracy and dysfunctional state apparatuses are something I experienced even kind of sometimes in day-to-day things while I was there. Kind of anything I had to do officially in terms of documents would be really complicated. For example, my visa application, which took months. I had to start it pretty much as soon as I arrived, and every time you got a document that they asked for, they would then ask you for another document that they hadn't mentioned before. And just depending on who you got for your interview, things could go entirely differently depending on what kind of day they were having, to be honest. I think once, my second time, I had to renew my visa halfway through. I somehow managed to upset the person doing my interview. I don't know if that was my language skills or what the problem was, but I had to wait until someone else would actually come and help me and fix it. So as a British citizen, as a, I think, EU citizen as well, you have 3 months visa free in Bosnia when you arrive, but because the visa application process takes so long and is so complicated, you pretty much have to start it as soon as you arrive, or at least not long after, if you're planning to live there for over 3 months. All of this political dysfunction has affected the demographics of the country, as I kind of referred to earlier. The population drastically decreased during the course of the war for obvious reasons. But while there was a slight sort of increase and population bounce after the war due to returning refugees, the numbers have been decreasing at least for the last decade now. This is partly due to falling birth rates, which is common across Europe, but also primarily in Bosnia because of large emigration, especially of young educated people who prefer to go to Western Europe, places like Germany and the UK and Sweden. And and earn more money there outside of the sort of poor and dysfunctional economy and system that they experienced back in Bosnia. This brain drain really just exacerbates the problem, which is a shame because in the long run, these young educated people are the kind of people who have the power to enact change, would be the perfect candidates to fix and improve the system. So finally, on the geography side of things, before I go into my own personal travel experience, I want to talk about some of the physical geography and information about the country. The Balkan Peninsula as a whole is pretty mountainous, and Bosnia is one of the most mountainous within that region. The highest mountain is Maglic in the south on the border with Montenegro, but within the urban area of Sarajevo, where I lived, of course, there are many tall mountains as well. The highest being Bjelašnica at just over 2,000 meters, 2 kilometers, with Jahorina and Trebević being slightly smaller than that. Jahorina actually is where some of the skiing in the 1984 Winter Olympics happened, and now the 1984 Winter Olympics is something that Sarajevo are very proud of, and it's also where I learned to snowboard in January 2019. The climate is what we call humid continental, so it has hot summers with some rain and cold snowy winters. I remember in the summers quite often there was a lot of really short thunderstorms, particularly in the evening, sort of around 5 o'clock. It would be really hot and humid, like over 30 degrees during the day, and then after these thunderstorms, temperature would drop quite a lot overnight. Winter could be variable, so while it's usually cold and snowy, there were sometimes days or weeks where the temperature just jumped up, partly because of something called the phone wind effect, which happens when there's mountains nearby, despite, being freezing and snowy a few days previous. But we could also have days and weeks where the temperature dropped to about -10, so it was very variable during the winter. I think I enjoy that. I think I like a place that has defined seasons, and it kind of always keeps things different and interesting while you're there. I like sun and warmth, obviously, but I also kind of like snow when it's cold. Whereas in Scotland, for example, it's just kind of mild and rainy and windy all year, which is not my favourite weather, personally, to be honest. The only kind of issue with that climatic feature of Sarajevo is that because of the mountains and the way that Sarajevo is shaped, in the middle of winter, the freezing air can trap a lot of sort of fog and smog in the city, and it's not the most pleasant. There's not really much wind to clear that smog away as well. It's only really a problem in winter, particularly in sort of January time, because everybody's heating their houses with coal and wood fires, as well as sort of the freezing fog and that sort of mountain bowl shape that kind of traps the dirty air at ground level. It's actually nice and kind of refreshing when you go up in the mountains during winter. You get above a certain point and you reach fresh air, and it's really nice, and there's sun and there's snow, as opposed to the kind of low-lying, cold, dirty fog at ground level. So, like I said, spent 2 years there and was mostly working with refugees, as well as kind of with local youth and doing some artistic projects and various different things. This is because since around 2015, a lot of migrants and refugees started coming to Europe for various political and kind of war reasons, particularly from Syria, Afghanistan, Somalia, places like that. And one of the main routes that they took into Europe was overland, first of all through Turkey, then Greece, and then into the Balkans, with the intention of ending up in Western Europe. However, this became a huge political issue. There was a lot of kind of drama and chaos at the time in terms of inside the European Union. And a lot of European countries closed their borders and started patrolling them very tightly. So thousands of people ended up stuck in Bosnia, which has a border with Croatia. Croatia is in the European Union and Bosnia is not. It was an interesting, often emotional job as well, of course. And the exact details of what I was doing, to be honest, just changed week to week and month to month. There were often a lot of children, families, but people would arrive, only stay there for a month or two, and then try and cross the border. Then maybe they get sent back because they fail, and then they try and cross the border again. So it was an always changing situation. Sometimes I would kind of try and play games with the kids and take them away from the camp, try and give them something to enjoy as a childhood. Sometimes we'd help cook meals and organize events, receive donations, kind of organize celebrations. A big example of one's Persian New Year, because there were a lot of Iranians and Afghans there. And generally just try and support them, live alongside these people as best as we could. We didn't have a lot of kind of resources for major humanitarian kind of impact. The situation in Bosnia is far too big for NGOs, but NGOs are the only one really doing anything about it. So, of course, being part of that community, working with refugees, I did also want to use my language learning to engage and integrate with the local Bosnian culture. Some of my closest friends were and still are Bosnian. The culture is so fascinating, and while many people in my general age group still have trauma from growing up being children during the war in the 1990s, Bosnia have a very relaxed outlook on life and a very great sense of humour. The culture of just sitting and having coffee and chatting for hours made socializing and fitting in so much easier, and I learned to enjoy traditional Bosnian coffee, which is made with what's called a jezva, and kind of finely ground coffee in the Turkish style. I actually have an example here. So this is the jezva. You would put the ground coffee inside. I might have a video of me making it, possibly, depending on the editing post afterwards, but it's very thick, very strong. But very nice. You drink it slowly, usually with some Turkish delight or a little sugar cube as well. So it's definitely a huge part of the culture there. You have to learn to drink coffee. You can just about get away without doing a few other things, but coffee is pretty much non-negotiable. At very least, kind of participating in that culture, even if you're not actually drinking it. In terms of food, traditional famous Bosnian food is probably cevapi, which is basically grilled meat. It's kind of like a kebab, served with flatbread, onions, and something called kaymak, which is a type of cream cheese. It'd be very hard for a vegetarian in Bosnia, to be honest. There's a lot of grilled meat, a lot of that kind of thing. Things like sarma and stuffed peppers, which have sort of minced meat inside, along with onions, cabbage, things like that. My favourite Bosnian food would probably be either those stuffed peppers called punjena paprika, or sirnica, which is a baked phyllo pastry with cottage cheese, feta. I put some mozzarella in when I make it. If I remember to put a picture up on screen, I have made it a few times since I got home from Bosnia, and it's just perfect. The nostalgia and happiness it brings me is just wonderful, honestly. Though you can get other types of burek, other types of phyllo pastry. Mainly burek in Bosnia refers to with meat. Only refers to the meat version. Whereas in Serbia, Croatia, other parts of the region, the word burek is used for all kinds of phyllo pastry, which leads to a few sort of internet memes and jokes. Jokes about burek sa sirom, which means burek with cheese, but in Bosnia, burek with cheese is called sirnica, and burek is just with meat. In a lot of ways, going to Bosnia was like stepping back into the 1990s almost. There were lots of old cars there, even a few kind of British cars that I remember my family having when I was really young. Like the Rover, for example. And the smell of kind of wood burning and being allowed to smoke in cafes also kind of feels very old-fashioned. Bosnia has taken a while to sort of adapt to modern environmental issues, for example. I believe since I came back to Scotland from Bosnia in 2020 that they have officially banned indoor smoking in public as an attempt to conform to EU laws and hopefully join the European Union in the future. I am really skeptical as to how enforceable that will be. Coffee and cigarettes inside smoky cafes, especially in winter, is just kind of something that's very common there, so I'm interested to see how they enforce it. Many places only accept cash, or at least prefer cash, certainly, although most newer restaurants and places have the option of contactless payments, and I'm sure the country as a whole is kind of slowly catching up on that and will become less cash dependent over time. It was a little bit of a hassle getting my local bank account when I first arrived. Eventually I got an account with the Ziraat, which is a Turkish bank. I remember my parents came to visit in 2018. My dad tried to exchange some Scottish banknotes, only for them to refuse because apparently they looked strange, they didn't recognise them, and would only really exchange pounds if they were from Bank of England. The currency is called the mark, or convertible mark officially, and is tied 1-to-1 with the old Deutschmark from the late 1990s. Obviously, since Germany and the rest moved to the euro, the currency has now been tied 1 to 1.95 with the euro. So 1 euro is equal to 1.95 marks. And that exchange rate is constant, fixed, doesn't change. One element of Bosnian culture that I really liked was traditional seftah music. It has influence from kind of Turkish, Jewish, Roman music. Some songs can be slow and sad, others can be fast and really good for dancing to. A lot of songs are about, lost love and that sort of topic. In a lot of ways, I think it actually has some similarities to Portuguese fado music. Some of my favourite artists in the genre are probably Divan Hanna, probably my favourite, Amira Medjunjanin as well. Maybe one day I'll upload my own version actually of some of these songs, so you can see what it's like, and I can sing in Bosnian, that would be fun. In addition to that traditional folk music, there's a lot of pop and rock from the 1970s, from the Yugoslav period. Early kind of 70s and 80s Yugoslav pop rock is very popular, and that kind of goes hand in hand with a lot of Yugoslavia nostalgia. in Bosnia specifically and in Sarajevo. Their calendars kind of on sale in the old town with Tito, Yugoslavia's former dictator, on. There are kind of things with Yugoslavia flags and pictures from the 70s and 80s. And there's a cafe near where I lived, my first flat there, called U Cafe, which is filled with posters, vinyls, flags, other memorabilia from the Yugoslav period. I guess with how things have been since Yugoslavia ended, firstly with the war, and then the economic regression, stagnation, and Bosnia's difficult recovery from the war, Yugoslavia probably seems like the last time that things were sort of stable, secure, and richer in Bosnian in terms of an economic sense. So finally, one element of life in Sarajevo as a foreigner is that there's so many events for expats and international residents. For one thing, obviously because Sarajevo is the capital city, all the embassies are located there, and these embassies regularly host public and social events. British Embassy, my embassy, would host a pub quiz every month, I think it was, and I ended up forming this kind of regular group with a few of my language classmates. We'd be the same team in every quiz every month. I don't remember if we ever won it. We finished second a few times and got some prizes. I think we did win it once. Suspiciously, the team of the ambassador's wife won once or twice. I'm not suggesting that there's anything going on, but we'll overlook that. The embassy also hosted a Robert Burns night every year, so for me as a Scottish person, that was obviously important. For those who don't know, Robert Burns is Scotland's national poet, and Burns Night is really our national holiday. We have a patron saint, St Andrews, but it's really not as important as Burns Night is. So Burns Night in Scotland involves traditional Scottish country dancing, as well as traditional food and poems that are read out from Robert Burns. So before one of these events, the embassy hosted some rehearsals, as most people attending weren't Scottish, needed to learn the dances. And I was the only Scottish person at this specific rehearsal. I ended up teaching the British ambassador's wife how to dance some of the Ceilidh dances, which is kind of one of my major claims to fame. It also ended up being beneficial having embassy connections when the pandemic hit. I was able to get advance warning of Bosnia's airport closing, for example, as one of my friends works in the embassy. Actually, she works in the Foreign Office now, but whatever. So I was able to book a more urgent flight home than the one we'd originally planned, which was like a month later, and I wouldn't have been able to get home if I'd just been going for that flight. So Bosnia is also home to a lot of NGOs as well as embassies and charities that date back to the war. While a lot of these organizations started as humanitarian things, nowadays they're involved in all sorts of projects and kind of various events, and that helps to give Sarajevo a large expat and international community. There are probably 1,000 other things I could go into when it comes to Bosnia and my experiences there. Like I said, if anyone has any questions about anything I've talked about, I would love for you to let me know, and I will answer in like follow-ups and Q&As. I really enjoyed bringing my knowledge and experiences to you, and kind of things about geography, and I hope that this is something you're interested in, I can do more of. I have many other countries to come in this series, places I've been to, and lots of videos that I'm rating about kind of languages and current events. I should have a language video going up, I don't know, maybe in the next few days. It depends when I release this, when I finish editing. So stay tuned for that. But next up in this series, the geography and travel thing, is probably going to be the place where I studied for 10 months in 2015, and that's Spain. So I'll see you next time, hopefully soon. Until then, take care of yourselves, and bye for now.